Thank you for joining us for another episode of Boom and Bust. I'm your host, Tony Clement. I'm here at the News Forum where all voices matter. In our continuing coverage of the British Columbia flood catastrophe, our hearts go out to all those affected. This is an unprecedented situation, and I sincerely hope that relief is found soon. Meanwhile, we continue to examine the emergency from different vantage points. Joining us today to assess are David Clement. He is no relation. He is the North American Affairs Manager of the Consumer Choice Centre. And Colin Craig also rejoins us. He is the president of Second Street, which is a national think tank. Welcome to both of you.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you very much.
Gentlemen, maybe I'll start with you, David, and then Colin. But how does this emergency situation tie in with the question about the emergency preparedness of our country?
So the big takeaway that I see from what's happened in BC is really the warning signs that were given to government well in advance. I know that there were headlines saying that there was a 2015 report explaining what was vulnerable and what was at risk. And for me, I think that not only does this example in BC, which is tragic, and the pandemic, both show that emergency preparedness across the board is particularly poor, whether it be at the federal level or the provincial level. And so we have to start to ask ourselves, why is that? I think one of those reasons is that it's not a particularly attractive policy plank in regards to preparing for something that people haven't seen. And so it's not necessarily something that is front of mind in the political discourse when we talk about elections and political parties and things like that. And really, all that does is leave us holding the bag at the end of whether it be COVID or what's happened in BC, wondering what's went wrong and why we weren't prepared. And so I think now is a fairly good opportunity to have some reflection in regards to these key emergency preparedness measures.
Colin, do you see an emergency preparedness gap in this country as well?
I think so, and I think David's hit the nail on the head. Is that spending money on emergency preparedness? It's not a sexy thing for governments to spend money on.
Yeah,
and quite often they don't get the credit for it when they do, because you never need this infrastructure, equipment, whatever it is, until you actually do need it, obviously. And so often, the people that invest the money in it may not always get the credit for it. But I think we certainly need to see a lot more of governments focusing in on what we need the government to do: spend money on infrastructure, make sure it's maintained, make sure that we've got proper dikes in place and so forth, rather than some of the crazy stuff that we routinely hear about governments spending money on. Just recently I was talking to someone from BC, and they're kind of scratching their head because the federal government's been spending money on, sponsoring some kind of an exhibit in Germany to, demonstrate some sex toys that an artist has come up with. Well, why is the government spending money on that stuff when you've got dikes in BC that need to be repaired? You've got a pump house there that the authorities had recommended upgrading for many, many years now. That's what governments should be focused in on, not on half of the distractions that they waste our money on so frequently.
And what Colin has said there is especially true in the context of government debt. So obviously, debt is at very, very high levels. And so the need to reprioritize where government money goes is more important now than ever. Mm-hmm. Colin brings up what some people may think is a trivial example, but there are countless examples. And when you have finite resources,
right,
you do really have to question why we spend money on one thing over another.
Yeah, I know it's an age-old thing. I'll just make an editorial comment myself, having been in government. I think part of the problem is structural when it comes to emergency preparedness. I'm talking now because you don't have just a minister of emergency preparedness. He or she might be public safety minister at the same time. So there's always, even within the department, a push and pull to see how those resources are allocated and what the budget ask is. And you can't be the public safety minister without asking for more money for public safety. And then my observation is that emergency preparedness gets the short end of the stick. So that's just my editorial comment. I'll be the third. The third guest for this program just on that point. We're going to take a short break, and we'll be back with our guests. Please stay with us. Welcome back to Boom and Bust. I'm your host, Tony Clement, here at the News Forum with our guests. We've got David Clement. He is the Northern Affairs Manager for the Consumer Choice Center, and Colin Craig, who is the head of Second Street think tank, talking about sort of the broader implications of the BC flooding catastrophe. We know it's on the ground, it's all about human beings whose lives are affected, but we're taking a broader policy approach as well. David, you've said that our trade relationship with the United States has to be strengthened after this. Can you elaborate a little bit on that?
Yeah, I mean, this is both important nationally, but exponentially more important for British Columbia. So Trudeau was just meeting with President Biden. They were talking about whether Canadian products were going to be included in Buy American, which I think, of course, they should. This is the greatest trading relationship in the world. It should be enhanced, not limited. And the response after that meeting was an increase in lumber tariffs.
Yeah.
And so we're talking about, that's not directly related to disaster recovery in BC, but it surely is related to the economic recovery for both, and not even both, the three disasters that the province is dealing with in regards to fire recovery, the flooding, and COVID. And so it couldn't come at a worse time. And it really just begs the question of why there isn't a stronger push to ensure that our products have access to the American market.
Colin, any thoughts on that yourself?
Well, no, I think David's right. And I think we need to especially be thinking about not just dealing with the flood and what's happening right now. And we need to keep in mind, it's not a BC issue, it's a Canada issue. This is affecting many, many provinces, consumers across the country, because so many goods are coming in from BC. So many products that Canadians make too get shipped to BC, and then they go out through the port and abroad too. So it's very much a Canadian issue.
Right.
But we need to be thinking about too the enormous bills that are going to be coming due for dealing with this aftermath. And as David mentioned, it's on top of COVID. It's on top of the fire situation. BC government had 2 credit downgrades this past summer. And so when your financial position starts to get shaky, the cost of borrowing debt keeps going up and up and up. So it needs to be thinking, I think, too, about, okay, so once we get the infrastructure needs under control, when roads are open and highways and bridges are fixed, what do we do to make sure that the economy is good and strong and creating the wealth to pay these bills? And so I think governments really need to be thinking about some of the options on the table that are well known, that don't cost governments money, but can get people working, create the wealth to pay for this very unfortunate disaster.
Well, you've actually said, Colin, that now is the time to discuss more pipelines after this. So is that one of the things you're referring to?
I think that's certainly part of it. I mean, we're hearing of rationing of gas in British Columbia. Amazingly, people don't seem to realize that gasoline, jet fuel, diesel, all those products are things that our society still very much needs. And, 10, 15 years from now, maybe that discussion changes a bit as we see more technology evolving. But certainly for now, we need those resources. British Columbians need those resources. So instead of protesting the Trans Mountain Pipeline, maybe those protesters could, get to work and help see it completed, so that those resources are there for consumers in the short term. But it's not just the Trans Mountain Pipeline. I mean, BC has a huge opportunity to develop liquefied natural gas. Right. And that's a good thing for the environment, because if you develop that and export it, you can get it to countries that are using coal for electricity generation right now. So using natural gas helps reduce emissions, but at the same time, it helped create tons of jobs and tons of wealth for the province of BC. And that's one way they can pay for all these roads and bridges that need to be repaired.
Yeah, David, why don't you weigh in on this? We've got less than a minute before the break, but that's the kind of new thinking that is probably necessary, right?
Yeah, and the thing is they're not even they're not contradictory to the province's own climate goals. So if we look at LNG, RNG, waste to energy, all of the great things and emerging technologies that are coming out of British Columbia, it would be great if those resources could flow more freely across the country and more freely out of the country. I mean, if we talk about countries who, like you said, are using coal, it would be great if they were relying and leaning on cleaner resources from British Columbia as opposed to burning coal. And so we should be able to offer them that opportunity.
Yeah, no, great point. We're going to take another short break, though, and we'll be back with our guests right after that. Please stay with us. And we're back here at Boom and Bust. I'm your host, Tony Clement, here with David Clement, no relation, North American Affairs Manager for the Consumer Choice Center. And Colin Craig is also with us. Again, he is the president of Second Street, a national think tank. Supply chains, let's talk a little bit about them. They have been stretched or even destroyed due to the flooding, but they were stretched even beforehand. So what needs to be done there? David, you want to start us off?
So I think first off, we have to have a serious conversation about interprovincial trade borders, or
Right.
trade barriers, sorry. And most people don't know how ridiculous this can get. And I'll give you a real example. An example of a truck carrying goods from PEI through to, let's say, Manitoba would have to have different medical kits in their cabin for each province. Depending on the province and the payload, the width of the tires could be in violation with whatever the code is. All of those things make it incredibly difficult to move goods across provincial boundaries.
Right.
And none of those barriers should exist. We're a country. We should have free trade between our provinces. That, I think, is something. I don't know what the latest polling is, but I think it's well over 90%.
Sure.
Say that that's a no-brainer. And so if we're talking about supply chains, we're talking about reshoring, all of those very valid discussions. We also have to talk about how we move things across the country.
Colin, reshoring, onshoring, interprovincial, where do you want to go on this topic?
Well, I couldn't agree more with David. There's a Senate report from a couple of years back, and they said that this problem that we have in Canada that makes it so hard to get goods from one part of the country to another for businesses to work together, it costs our economy upwards of $130 billion a year. It is a massive, massive problem. There's all kinds of anecdotes like the one that David just mentioned. And for perspective, I think it was about a year ago, the Prime Minister said he wanted to stimulate the economy to get it going again because of COVID, and he was going to spend $100 billion. So that's going out, racking up debt. Taxpayers have to pay for the debt, the interest costs, and so forth. You could get a larger stimulus effect by just simply getting rid of all these really bad rules that make it hard for businesses and consumers to do business with each other in different parts of the country. There's so many examples. One I heard about in that Senate report was a brewery company in Nova Scotia. They wanted to start selling beer into Newfoundland. But at the time, Newfoundland had a different set of rules around the size of bottles. So they eventually threw up their hands and they said, well, we'll just try and sell our product in the States instead. So, it's examples like that. Just get rid of all this red tape, make it a priority. You could create lots of economic growth. That would help BC's economy, the rest of the country, as we try and rebuild, not just from the floods in BC, but from COVID and other challenges.
Yeah, go ahead, David, and I've got a supplementary, but go ahead.
I was just going to say, it really is as simple as, if it's good enough for thee, it's good enough for me. If it passes code in PEI, it's good enough anywhere else in Canada. If it's good enough for the folks in British Columbia, it's good enough for the folks in Ontario. And so it really is summed up in one line. And when you say that to most people, they don't even realize the problem exists.
No, and I guess the point I was going to make was that there's no real relevant health or safety reason for a lot of this red tape. It's just different historical or cultural context, or just different people making rules. Human beings in Nova Scotia making one rule, human beings in Newfoundland making another rule. Is that Colin? Does that make sense? How this happened?
I think for the most part you're right, Tony. I think there may be some cases where governments try to protect their industry and keep it safe from another business in another province competing. But at the end of the day, it benefits consumers if we have this free flow of trade of goods and products and services between the country. It makes it much easier. We should be doing that instead of like we talked about. Some companies look at the U.S. because it's easier to do business down there than it might be with another province. That doesn't make any sense in this day and age.
Yeah. Do you see any? We've got about 40 seconds left. David or Colin, jump in. Is there any movement with the federal government on this?
I was a part of the Canadian Free Trade's Reconciliatory Board. I wish I had more positive things to say. They mean well, but it's very much tinkering at the margins. There are some folks in Conservative caucus who know that this is a problem and would want to be much more aggressive on it. But other than that, the outlook is not positive.
We'll return with our guests after the break. Still a lot of topics to consider and talk about as we monitor the BC flooding situation. Please stay with us. Welcome back to Boom and Bust. I'm your host, Tony Clement, here with David Clement, no relation, as I keep saying, the North American Affairs Manager for the Consumer Choice Center. You're in Washington, David, or are you back in the...
I'm based just outside of Toronto.
Just outside of Toronto. Yeah, my mistake. Yep. And of course, Colin Craig is also with us, the president of Second Street, which is a national think tank. Now I'm going to throw the cat amongst the pigeons here with this BC flooding catastrophe. Has this tragedy, and I want to say this the right way, I'm not casting aspersions, but sometimes these tragedies are seen as a great way to weaponize the debate over climate change, and obviously there is an ongoing debate about that. This may or may not fit into that, but I'd love to get your comments on that. David, any thoughts on this?
Yeah, is it in relation to climate change? I think that on both sides of that debate, people will often conflate weather with climate, and they'll say, oh, we have record high rainfall, or it's cold, does global warming exist? Is it part of the climate change discussion? Absolutely. I think it is. Does that mean that we need to take severely and economically disastrous policies in response to it? I don't think so. Going back to what Colin had said in regards to liquefied natural gas, there is a way to lean on existing and emerging technologies to become greener while generating economic growth. And so I don't think now is not the time to go down the road of the Extinction Rebellion and the folks who basically want to shut down anything made from fossil fuels. But I do think that it is an important conversation in regards to climate change and these disasters.
Yeah, Colin, what any thoughts on this?
Yes, I think with this topic, there's two things. We have to be talking about reducing emissions when it comes to climate change. We also have to be talking about adaptation. Mm-hmm. And as mentioned before, authorities had mentioned or had recommended to government officials for a long time now that you need to be doing things in that region of BC that's being affected right now. You've got to upgrade one of the pump houses. You've got to fix some of these dikes that are really old and they're not strong enough. Those are the unsexy things that I think governments need to be looking at, not just in British Columbia, but across the country. If the temperature for the planet continues to warm, what are the other examples of infrastructure that are going to need to be upgraded? And, that needs attention, certainly, rather than some of the other things that we see governments spending time and energy on.
Yeah, and I think that sometimes there's a lack of humility on the side of the folks who think we need to go 100% in the very restrictionist direction, as if Canada were to reduce our emissions to zero tomorrow, what overall impact would that have on global emissions. It would be very little because we are not population-wise a large country. And so we have to have, that's where the adaptation equation comes in, because at the end of the day, if we were at zero emissions tomorrow, we would still be dealing with climate change because there are developing countries who are not as developed as we are, who rely on, unfortunately, rely on things like coal and are not as environmentally conscious as we are.
Yeah, no, you both raised very good points. I was told today that China's carbon emissions now exceed the USA plus Western Europe. So again, Canada can do its part, of course, but we're not going to be the solution unless many other countries are also part of the solution. 30 seconds left. Colin, you were talking about adaptation, the kind of the forgotten sister to the climate change debate. Can we change that around?
I think so. It comes down to political leadership. And with that, I think we also need to be talking about the other A word, and that's accountability. Who's going to be held accountable for ignoring all these reports that said that you need to upgrade the pump house, you need to fix your dikes, and all the other examples that authorities have been warning about?
Gentlemen, we're going to have to leave it at that. Our time is up, but I want to thank both of you for being part of the program, and clearly a lot to continue to discuss. My best wishes to both of you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I want to thank our panelists today. Obviously, we're keeping an eye, the whole network is keeping an eye on the catastrophe that is still ongoing in British Columbia. A lot of people suffering there. But we also want to know what the longer term solutions can be in terms of infrastructure, emergency preparedness, all of these public policy issues. Thanks for joining us today.